On June 7, 1944, Obergefreiter Heinrich Severloh of the 352nd Infantry Division picked up the field telephone in his concrete strongpoint above the Normandy coast and reported what he had been shooting at for 19 hours. The interior of WN-62 smelled of cordite and hot metal. The MG-42 barrel had been changed 7 times. The loader beside him had not been relieved since the previous afternoon. The salt wind through the firing slit carried the sound of surf underneath the screaming from the shingle below. The popular image of the German soldier on the Western Front survives in 2 cartoons. The Wehrmacht poster, clean Feldgrau, MP40, confident jaw, or its mirror, the cardboard fanatic. Neither image matches the documented reality preserved in the 1.3 million surviving Feldpost letters held at the Museum for Communication in Berlin, the OB West War Diaries at Bundesarchiv RH 1904, and the Schaef G2 prisoner interrogation reports at the National Archives in College Park, Record Group 332. The average Lanzer on the Western Front in June 1944 was 32 years old. He had been in uniform for 38 months. He had already served on the Eastern Front. He was 11 kilograms underweight. He had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours in 11 days. The 7th Army Strength Return of June 5, 1944, filed under RH 19IX/7, listed gaps in every coastal regiment. The ration scale had collapsed from 4,500 calories per day in 1940 to under 2,800 by the spring of 1944, recorded in the Heeresverwaltungsamt files. Feldpost number 28344 belonged to the 352nd Infantry Division. The transport columns of the 7th Army were running on captured French civilian fuel. The medical clearing station at Bayeux on June 9th would record that 41% of captured German wounded arrived with untreated chronic infections predating the invasion. 3 names, 3 numbers, 3 places. What Severloh had been shooting at for 19 hours into the men climbing out of the landing craft below was the same arithmetic the High Command had been pretending not to see for 2 years. And the letter in his breast pocket, written 4 days earlier to a girl in Württemberg, said so in his own handwriting, in a sentence the post-war historians would not read until 1987. The West here, the forgotten army of a regime that had already lost the East. In the autumn of 1943, the Wehrmacht command in the West was forced to assemble an army out of what was left. The Eastern Front had consumed the institutional here through 18 months of attrition the operational record cannot soften. Stalingrad alone removed the entire 6th Army from the order of battle by February 2, 1943. Kursk, in the first 2 weeks of July that year, broke the armoured reserve that was supposed to refit the West. The strength returns filed at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, the headquarters of Oberbefehlshaber West, did not lie about what remained. They simply listed it. 64-year-old General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt had been OB West since March 1942. He had nominal command of a front of 4,800 kilometers from the North Cape of Norway to the Spanish frontier. The forces under that command existed in 2 tiers, on paper 58 divisions. In reality, 33 of them were classified Bodenständig, static, meaning they had no organic transport, reduced artillery, fewer rifles per battalion than the table of organization specified, and in many cases horse-drawn supply trains because the trucks had been sent east. The OB West strength returns of June 1, 1944, filed at Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv Freiburg under RH 1904/29, list the deficit in cold columns. The German historian Peter Lieb, whose 2007 monograph Konventioneller Krieg oder NS Weltanschauungskrieg remains the standard German language reconstruction of Westheer composition, traced the divisional rosters man by man. The picture is unambiguous. The Auskämmation of late 1943, the combing out action, stripped men from arms factories in the Ruhr, occupation garrisons in Norway and the Balkans, and Luftwaffe ground crews whose aircraft no longer flew and pushed them toward the west. 2 weeks of rifle training, a new collar tab, an infantry assignment, Luftwaffe field divisions and Kriegsmarine remusters filled rosters that had been empty since the previous winter. The replacement reaching the 716 Infantry Division at Caen in March 1944 was 41 years old and had last fired a rifle in the trenches of the Western Front in 1918. The replacement, reaching the 709th at Cherbourg, was a 46-year-old machinist from Düsseldorf whose Wehrpass recorded a heart condition. These were not exceptional cases. The Corps War Diary of the 84th Army Corps, RH-24-84 at Freiburg, records the medical profiles of the incoming drafts in entries that span the winter of 1943 into the spring of 1944. The recurring phrase in the medical officer's hand is bedingt verwendungsfähig, conditionally fit for service. It applied to nearly a third of the men reaching the coastal regiments by April. The other layer was darker still. The Ostbataillone, Eastern Volunteer Battalions, were composed largely of former Soviet prisoners of war who had agreed to serve in German uniform rather than die in the camps. Documented in Bundesarchiv RH-53-23, they were attached to coastal divisions across Normandy and Brittany: Georgians, Azeris, Ukrainians, Volga Tatars, Cossacks, Crimean Tatars, Armenians. By the spring of 1944, units like the 439th, 441st, 642nd, and 795th Ostbataillon were holding sectors of the Cotentin coast under German company officers who spoke none of their languages and trusted none of their loyalties. The Corps inspections of March and April 1944 record translator shortages in nearly every battalion. The documented refusal rate inside these battalions, when the invasion came, was not concealed in the post-war record. It was simply not retrieved by it. The 439th Ostbataillon, attached to the 709th Infantry Division near Sainte-Mère-Église, would surrender as an organized unit within 48 hours of the first American airborne drops on June 6. The Volksdeutsche conscripts came in from Alsace-Lorraine, Luxembourg, and the annexed Eupen-Malmedy zone, men with German surnames whose mother tongue had been French for 2 generations, whose families were hostages to compliance, whose service files at RH-15 record the legal mechanism by which their citizenship was reassigned in 1940, and their military obligation followed within months. The Alsatian conscripts called themselves malgré nous, in spite of ourselves. More than 130,000 of them were drafted into the Wehrmacht across the war. A significant share served on the Eastern Front. A measurable minority were rotated west by the spring of 1944. The political reliability of these men was a constant concern in the Corps weekly reports. The reports do not record what those men felt. They record what their commanders feared. This was the army that would meet the largest amphibious operation in history. The men who built the popular memory of the West here wrote later. Rundstedt's post-war interrogators in 1945 found him courteous and lucid. His chief operations officers gave testimony at Nuremberg and supplied the first English-language framework through which the Western Front would be understood. Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, wrote his memoir Invasion 1944 in 1949. The Foreign Military Studies program at the U.S. Army Historical Division collected over 2,500 manuscripts from captured German officers between 1945 and 1959. The framework that emerged from these documents was not invented, it was simply selective. It centered the officer corps. It emphasized command decisions. It located the catastrophe in Hitler's interference and the misallocation of the Panzer Reserve. It rarely looked at the 46-year-old machinist from Düsseldorf with the heart condition. The archive recorded both stories. The published history retrieved one. By the late spring of 1944, the men who would meet the invasion were already in position in concrete, in fields, in farmhouses requisitioned from French families, waiting in a coastline they had been told was inviolable. And the lie of that inviolability was being written in their own daily reports. The Atlantic Wall, the concrete fiction the soldiers built with their own hands. The average Lanzer of the coastal divisions in the spring of 1944 was 32 years old. He was tired, undernourished, often a Polish, Alsatian or Czech conscript, and he was building with his own hands the wall he was supposed to die behind. This profile is not a literary composite. It is the documented intersection of 2 independent record sets. The Feldpost letters archived at the Museum für Communication Berlin and the Deutsches Tagebucharchiv at Emmendingen, and the Schaef G2 interrogation reports of captured West Heer prisoners filed at Nara Record Group 331 from October 1943 onward. The 2 archives, compiled by enemies on opposite sides of a war, agree. The propaganda films told a different story. The Atlantic Wall newsreels of 1943 showed concrete casemates, naval guns in turrets, obstacles seeded along beaches at low tide, machine gun positions interlocking across 2 kilometers of dune. The footage was real. The system was not. By the time General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel arrived to inspect Heeresgruppe B in January 1944, the wall had been under construction for nearly 3 years. His inspection reports filed in his own Heeresgruppe B war diary under Bundesarchiv RH-99 describe what he found. In the Normandy sector, the very ground on which the invasion would land, the wall was approximately 18% complete. The Lagerbericht of April 22, 1944, RH-99/4, records the assessment in his own staff officer's hand. The naval guns in turrets existed at Cap Gris-Nez and Cherbourg. They did not exist between the mouth of the Weir and the Orne. The beach obstacles were the project of his own arrival. They were being driven into the sand by static division Lanzer working at low tide through the spring. Rommel's standing order, that every soldier of Heeresgruppe B was to spend a portion of each day on the wall as a labourer, appears in his daily orders for February, March and April. The Lanzer called the obstacles Rommelspargel, Rommel's asparagus, with the affection a man reserves for the work that has blistered his hands and changed nothing. The daily routine of those men is preserved in the war diary of 84th Army Corps at RH 24-84, the corps that covered the Cotentin and Calvados sectors. 6 hours of construction labour, pouring concrete poured short on cement, digging Tobruk pits in the bocage, planting the angled stakes in flooded fields behind the beaches. 3 hours of guard rotation. 1 hour of weapons training, frequently dry. The ammunition shortage for live-fire exercises is documented in the Corps Quartermaster files for January through May 1944. The standing order for the 716 Infantry Division through that spring permitted no more than 3 rifle rounds per man per training session. The organisation taught construction battalions, drawn from the forced labour pool the Speer Ministry files account for in detail, did the bulk of the casemate work. The Lanzer did the rest with hand tools. The Todd pool itself included French civilian conscripts under the Service du Travail Obligatoire, Soviet civilians deported from occupied territories, North African workers from the Maghreb, and Spanish Republican exiles who had been interned in southern France since 1939. The wall the propaganda films attributed to German industrial might was built, in significant part, by men the regime had stripped of every other choice. The food the propaganda film did not show was logged in the Heeresverwaltungsamt ration tables, the official scale for a frontline soldier in 1940. 4,500 calories per day, including 250 grams of meat and 600 grams of bread, had collapsed by the spring of 1944 to under 2,800 calories. In the Ostbataillone, the scale was lower still. The Feldpost letter of a named Obergefreiter from the 716th Infantry Division, written in late May 1944, and now digitized in the Museum for Communication collection, describes hand blisters from concrete work, lice in the seams of his tunic, and a certainty that the English will come where we have no concrete. He used the word Lüge, lie. The same letter records that the company had been issued 1 bar of soap per man per month since February. The Hiwi auxiliaries, Hilfswillige, willing helpers, were former Soviet prisoners integrated into the German rifle squads at ratios that in some coastal battalions reached 1 in 4. The Corps War Diary records the integration figures by company. The Wehrmacht of June 1944 in Normandy was not a German army. It was a multinational static garrison, fed below its official ration, armed below its official table, holding a coastline its own commander told Berlin in writing was an 18% complete fiction. The SHFFG2 Order of Battle Handbooks of May 1944 at Nara RG 331 estimated all of this with surprising accuracy. British and American intelligence, working from aerial reconnaissance and the steady stream of prisoners captured in cross-channel commando raids, identified the static divisions by number, plotted their sectors, estimated their composition, and noted the Ostbataillone integration. The Allied planners knew, the German command knew, the men in the concrete knew. Here is the document that changes everything. The post-war memoirs that became the foundation of English-language Western Front history. Rundstedt's interrogations, Speidel's invasion 1944, the foreign military studies manuscripts, frame the catastrophe of June 1944 as a story of squandered armored reserves and Führer interference. Hitler interfered. The panzer divisions arrived late. The decisive moment was lost. The frame is not invented. The Panzer Reserve dispute is real, but it is not the only frame the archive offered. The OB West strength returns and the Heeresgruppe B Lagerbericht of April 22, 1944 told a more uncomfortable story, that the army holding the beach was already a fiction before the first landing craft lowered its ramp. The archive said one thing, the published history said another. It would take until the German military historian Peter Lieb published his archival reconstruction in 2007, 63 years after the invasion, for the rank-and-file documentation to enter the mainstream English-language conversation. Whatever the propaganda film showed of the Atlantic Wall, the men inside the concrete knew what was coming, and they knew by the first week of June that the High Command did not believe what its own coastal observers were reporting. 80 days in Normandy, the campaign that consumed the West here. At 6:30 hours on June 6, 1944, the first American assault wave touched the shingle at the foot of WN 62, and the men firing down on them had been awake for 31 hours. Obergefreiter Heinrich Severlow's MG 42 sat behind a firing slit roughly 50 meters above the high water mark of what the Allied operational maps designated Easy Red and Fox Green, the central sector of the beach Allied planners called Omaha. His own contemporaneous notes, reconstructed in his memoir WN 62, published in 2000, describe the morning in operational detail. The bombardment from naval gunfire offshore, the failure of the aerial preparation to crater the bluff, the moment the first landing craft ramps dropped, the angle of his firing arc, the ammunition expenditure his unit logged hour by hour. He fired, by his own account, for 9 hours before WN 62 was suppressed. Below him, the casualty arithmetic of the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions was being written. His was one strong point of dozens. The 352nd Infantry Division, holding the Omaha sector, had been moved into the line only weeks earlier and was not on the Allied order of battle estimates for the assault. The division's war diary, held in the RH-26 series at Freiburg, records the morning hour by hour. By 9 o'clock, the regimental commander of Grenadier Regiment 916, Oberst Ernst Goth, had committed his reserves. By midday, the divisional commander, Generalleutnant Dietrich Kress, was reporting penetrations he no longer had the manpower to contain. By the evening of June 6th, the 352nd had absorbed casualties on the order of 20% of its rifle strength. By June 11th, the figure had crossed 50%. The strength return of June 16th lists the division as combat effective in name only. To the west, in the Cotentin, the 91st Luftlandefähre Infantry Division was being destroyed in the first 48 hours by the American 82nd and 101st Airborne. Its commander, Generalleutnant Wilhelm Fally, was killed in an ambush by paratroopers on the morning of D-Day while returning from a war game conference at Rennes. The division's combat strength was reduced by more than half within 72 hours. The 716 Infantry Division, the static division holding Sword and Juno beaches, had battalions that by the divisional return of June 8th no longer existed as combat formations. 3 days, 3 battalions struck off the strength return. The Allied operational dominance was material. The 9th Tactical Air Command of the U.S. 9th Air Force put hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts over the Normandy battlefield by daylight. The Jabos, the German Lanzer term for the fighter bombers, made road movement in daylight impossible for any wheeled column. The war diary of Panzer Lehr Division records that on June 7th, attempting to move forward from Le Mans toward the bridgehead, the division lost between 40 and 80 vehicles to air attack in a single day, depending on the source. Its commander, Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, gave the higher figure in a post-war foreign military studies manuscript at Nara RG 549. The hedgerow country south of Carentan, the Bocage, devoured infantry. The historian Nicholas Zetterling, in his 2000 reconstruction Normandy 1944, drew the divisional casualty curves from the German strength returns. Frontline divisions lost between 50 and 70% of rifle strength within 3 weeks of commitment. The German MG-34 and MG-42 ambush at hedgerow corners, high rate of fire, short range, dense cover, withdrawal along sunken lanes, bought time at the cost of every gunner caught in the inevitable counter-barrage. The ration in encircled units collapsed to under 1,400 calories per day. The Heeresgruppe B medical reports record the Gefechtsneurose, combat exhaustion, diagnoses rising through July. The Bayeux clearing station logged between June 9th and June 30th alone, more than 1,200 German wounded passed into Allied custody. In Cayenne, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend fought through June and July with a rifle strength composed largely of men aged 17 and 18. They are the youngest documented combat cohort of the European War. Their commander in the field, Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, was 33 years old. The killings of Canadian prisoners at the Abbaye d'Ardennes on the nights of June 7th and 8th, what historians call the Ardennes Abbey killings, recorded in the December 1945 Auric War Crimes trial transcript at the Canadian Department of National Defence Directorate of History, placed Meyer under a death sentence later commuted. The trial record is the document. 20 Canadian soldiers from the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers did not survive the night. Meyer was released from custody in 1954, a fact the post-war Canadian press would not let the political class forget for the rest of the decade. The Allied interrogation reports of captured Lanza at the Kempton Park transit cage in England, filed at the National Archives at Kew under the WO 208 series, record the testimony of men brought across the Channel through June, July, and August. The interrogators noted exhaustion, hunger, lice, 11 kilograms of weight loss, the absence of any belief that the war could still be won. The political profiles varied. Some were committed Nazis, most were not. Many had served on the Eastern Front and had no illusions left to lose. One interrogator's summary, written in late July and held in the WO 208 series, observed that the captured men of the 352nd Division spoke of the invasion the way men speak of a flood, not as something they had fought, as something that had arrived. The closure of the Falaise pocket between August 17th and August 21st sealed what was left of two German armies in a corridor lined with destroyed vehicles, dead horses, abandoned artillery, and the wreckage of a force that had ceased to function as a coherent army. The OKW casualty returns of August 22, 1944, supplemented by Zetterling's reconstructed figures, place the 80-day Normandy total at approximately 290,000 men killed, wounded, captured, or missing, the equivalent of roughly 25 full divisions destroyed. The Schaeff interrogation of a named Lanza captured at Falaise on August 19th, recorded that summer and surfaced in the National Archives in the 1970s, describes walking unarmed beside thousands of his comrades through the corridor under a sky filled with Allied aircraft. He used the word Friedhof, cemetery. By the third week of August, what walked east out of the Falaise corridor was no longer an army. It was the surviving fraction of one, and the men inside that fraction would tell a story, when they finally told it, that the official Allied histories would not be ready to hear for 40 years. From the Seine to the Rhine, the retreat the soldiers were ordered not to call a retreat. In September 1944, the German army that had marched into Paris in 1940 walked back across the same roads in the opposite direction, and the units crossing the Reich border in the first week of that month were composed of men who 6 weeks earlier had been classified as unfit for frontline service. The retreat covered 600 kilometers in under 30 days. The order from OB West forbade the use of the word Rückzug. The official terminology was Absetzbewegung, disengagement movement. The men called it what it was. The railway network that had carried the 1940 invasion forward no longer existed in any operational sense. Allied strategic bombing through the spring and summer of 1944 had reduced the French and Belgian rail capacity by more than 70%. The German divisions retreating from Normandy moved on foot. The few remaining vehicles ran on captured Allied fuel where it could be found, on a synthetic fuel mixture where it could not. The march columns crossing the Meuse in the first week of September were stragglers stitched together from 12 or 15 broken divisions, walking under the air superiority of the US 9th Air Force and the British 2nd Tactical Air Force. The civilian witnesses in the Belgian and Luxembourg border villages, whose testimony was later collected by the historian Jean van Welkenhuizen, described columns moving only at night, dispersing into woods and farm buildings at dawn, the men stopping to drink from cattle troughs because they had no canteens left. Behind those columns, the Feldgendarmerie checkpoints were waiting. The military police of the Wehrmacht had been empowered by an order signed by Generalfeldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel in the late summer of 1944 to summarily process soldiers separated from their units. The historians Manfred Messerschmidt and Fritz Willner, in their 1987 archival reconstruction Die Wehrmacht Justiz im Dienste des Nationalsozialismus, documented the scale. Over 22,000 confirmed Wehrmacht death sentences across the war as a whole, with the largest concentration falling in the final 12 months. Between September 1944 and January 1945, at least 12,000 German soldiers were put to death by their own military justice system for desertion or for Wehrkraftsersetzung, undermining military morale. The figures are reconstructed from the surviving Feldgericht files at the Bundesarchiv. The Wehrmacht of the last winter was punishing its own men at a scale unprecedented in modern European military history. The Feldpost letter of a named Lanzer of the 89th Infantry Division, written from a position in the Hürtgenwald in December 1944, recovered from his personal effects after the war and held in a family deposit at the Deutsches Tagebucharchiv in Mendingen, describes a checkpoint at a crossroads west of Schmidt. A friend, separated from the unit during the previous night's withdrawal, was ordered out of the column. The letter does not describe what followed. It records only that the friend's name never appeared again on the company morning report. The historian must read between the lines. The Bundesarchiv does not. The West Wall, the Siegfried Line of the propaganda films, had been built in the late 1930s, then stripped of equipment and armament after the fall of France in 1940 to supply the Atlantic Wall. The units retreating through Aachen and the Eifel in September 1944 inherited concrete bunkers that no longer had the heavy weapons their firing slits were cut for. The Corps War Diaries of the 81st and 74th Army Corps record the inventory shortages. Mortars without base plates, anti-tank guns without their ranging optics, bunker doors that had been removed and shipped west 4 years earlier and never replaced. Engineer detachments arriving in mid-September found bunkers being used by local farmers for grain storage. Aachen, the first major German city to face direct Allied ground assault, held for 3 weeks in October. The American 1st Infantry Division and the 30th Infantry Division reduced the defense block by block. The defenders, drawn largely from the 246th Volksgrenadier Division and improvised police battalions, fought from a city centre already half destroyed by bombing. Oberst Gerhard Wilk surrendered the garrison on October 21st. The action report of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division at Nara records that the surrendering force was composed largely of men over 40 and under 18. The Aachen ration record for the week of October 14th to October 21st shows the garrison subsisting on roughly 1,100 calories per man per day. In the Hürtgenwald, the dense hilly forest east of Aachen, the U.S. First Army fought through September, October, November, and into the new year. The American casualty figures alone exceeded 33,000. The German defenders, drawn from the 275th, 89th, and 353rd Infantry Divisionen, fought in conditions that the war diaries describe in clinical terms: no winter clothing, no hot rations forward of regimental headquarters, replacement drafts of men over 40 and boys of 16, the documented winter clothing shortage of November 1944. The Foreign Military Studies series at Nara RG 549, the post-war manuscripts dictated by captured German officers between 1945 and 1959, preserves the operational accounts of these engagements in over 2,500 individual studies. General Major Rudolf von Gersdorf, dictating his account of the Hürtgen in 1946 under U.S. supervision, recorded that his divisions were issued replacement men at a rate that could not keep pace with frostbite alone. The Volksgrenadier divisions reconstituted through the autumn of 1944 were the regime's final manpower draft. Convalescents from rear area hospitals, Luftwaffe ground crews whose aircraft were grounded for lack of fuel, Kriegsmarine sailors whose ships could no longer sail, boys of 17. The Volkssturm, the Home Guard levy of November 1944, added men in their 50s and 60s, often with First World War rifles and a brassard for a uniform. The Ardennes counter-offensive of December 16, 1944, the operation the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge, was launched with this force. The training of the Volksgrenadier replacement waves had been compressed to 6 weeks. The training of the Volkssturm levies in many districts was conducted on Sunday afternoons in village squares. It bought the regime 4 weeks. It did not change the arithmetic. What waited for those men on the other side of the West Wall, in the forests above the Roer and on the snow-covered roads through the Ardennes, was not a reprieve, but the regime's final demand on what was left of them. Surrender at the Ruhr the moment the Westheer ceased to exist. On April 18, 1945, in a wooded ravine outside Düsseldorf, Generalfeldmarschall Walter Model dismissed the remnants of his army group and walked into the trees alone. Heeresgruppe B had been encircled by the US 1st and 9th Armies in the Ruhr Industrial Basin on April 1st. Inside the pocket, bounded roughly by the Rhine to the west, the Sieg to the south, the Lippe to the north, and the Allied advance to the east, were 18 German divisions in various states of disintegration, the headquarters of the 5th Panzer Army and the 15th Army, and a civilian population of more than 5 million. Model refused the surrender summons of April 15th. By April 16th, the pocket was being cut in two. By April 18th, organized resistance had ended. Model did not leave the woods alive. The body was recovered post-war, identified and reinterred at the German military cemetery at Vossenack by the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge. The numbers that came out of the Ruhr pocket are without precedent in Western military history. Approximately 325,000 German soldiers entered American captivity in 18 days. The figure exceeds the German surrender at Stalingrad. It exceeds the British surrender at Singapore. The German command had ceased to exist as a controlling institution. Battalion commanders surrendered their units to American platoon leaders. Divisional staffs walked into US Corps headquarters with the war diaries under their arms. The 5th Panzer Army headquarters surrendered intact. The records of the surrender process are at NARA Record Group 331, the Schaef operational files. The men who came out of the pocket were processed through the Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine Meadow camps, at Remagen, Sinzig, Andernach, Bad Kreuznach, and a dozen smaller sites along the western bank of the Rhine. The camps were open fields enclosed by wire. Through April, May, and into June 1945, the conditions in the larger camps were severe. The Schaef logistical system, which had not planned for prisoner intake on this scale, struggled with shelter, ration distribution, and sanitation. The U.S. Army medical reports of summer 1945, filed under RG 331, document the chronic shortages. The Sinzig site alone, at peak intake in late April, held more than 100,000 men on a field that had been planted with sugar beets 6 weeks earlier. The men slept on the ground. The April rain that year fell heavily, and the field turned to mud within days of the first arrivals. The mortality figures inside the Rheinwiesenlager became the subject of significant historiographic controversy in the late 1980s, when the Canadian writer James Bach published claims of mass deaths reaching the high hundreds of thousands. The claims were comprehensively rebutted in the 1992 academic volume Eisenhower and the German POWs, edited by Günther Bischoff and Stephen Ambrose, which drew on the full Maschke Commission documentation. The Maschke Commission, the West German government-funded multi-volume study of German prisoners of war in Western and Soviet captivity, published between 1962 and 1974 under the direction of the historian Erich Maschke, placed the deaths inside the Western Allied camp system in the low tens of thousands across all theatres, with the great majority caused by disease, exposure, and the chaotic logistical conditions of the first 6 weeks. The figure is high. It is not the figure Bach claimed. The historiography is settled. The popular memory in some quarters is not. The release timelines for the Western Front prisoners were sharply differentiated by captor and category. The Americans began processing routine releases by the summer of 1945 and had completed the bulk of repatriation by the end of 1946. The British retained labour in agricultural and reconstruction work into 1948. The French, who had requested the transfer of German labour as partial compensation for the occupation years, retained their assigned prisoners through 1948 in many cases. The Soviets, who held the prisoners taken on the Eastern Front, a separate category not processed through the Rheinwiesenlager, released the last of the approximately 3 million German prisoners they had held only in 1955, 10 years after the war ended. The figures are documented across the Maschke Commission volumes, the International Committee of the Red Cross Archive in Geneva, and the records of the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge. Inside the wire, the categories of German prisoner held legal weight. Members of the Waffen-SS, including the conscripted Volksdeutsche who had been drafted into SS units in the last years of the war without volunteering, were segregated for separate processing, and many were retained longer than their Wehrmacht counterparts. The denazification processing required interrogation, sworn statements, classification by category, and the production of the Fragebogen, the 131-question denazification questionnaire administered to millions of Germans by the Allied military government. The bureaucratic apparatus of the Allied occupation, more than any single trial, sorted the rank and file west here. The 5 categories, major offender, offender, lesser offender, follower, and exonerated, would follow the men into the rebuilt civilian Germany of the late 1940s and 1950s, shaping employment, pensions, and the public silence that descended over what the men had done and seen. A named survivor of the 352nd Infantry Division, recorded in a foreign military studies manuscript at Nara RG 549, dictated in a U.S. captivity facility in 1946, described standing in an enclosure outside Sinzig in the April rain with men from his own company. Some he had fought beside on Omaha, some he had not seen since the retreat across the Seine. They did not speak about the war. They spoke about the harvest, about wives, about whether the letters home were being delivered. The interrogator's note records that the man was 34 years old, weighed 56 kilograms, and had served continuously since September 1939. He had been issued a single Wehrmacht overcoat in November 1941 and was still wearing it. Here is the part the post-war consensus cannot explain away. The disappearance of the rank-and-file Lanzer experience from the dominant Western Front narrative is not a conspiracy. It is the structural outcome of 3 converging post-war pressures, each of which can be traced in the documentary record. First, Cold War political utility. When the West German Bundeswehr was reconstituted in 1955, the Federal Republic required a usable military past, and the early Bundeswehr historiography emphasized framings that separated the institutional Wehrmacht from the regime's worst actions. The Himmerod Memorandum, drafted in October 1950 by a small group of former Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS officers at a monastery in the Eifel, set the political terms on which West German rearmament would proceed, a public restoration of the honor of the German soldier as a precondition for the Federal Republic's contribution to NATO. The memorandum is at the Bundesarchiv. Its influence on the next 2 decades of public memory is not in dispute. Second, the Foreign Military Studies program itself. The captured German officers, not the ordinary soldiers, wrote the first authoritative English-language account of the war from inside U.S. custody between 1945 and 1959, and the officer perspective became the default frame for 2 generations of English-language military history. Third, the publishing market of the 1950s. The reading public preferred Rommel and tank narratives over the Feldpost letter of an Obergefreiter from Württemberg, and the publishers responded to the demand they had. The archive contained the rank-and-file voice from the beginning. The published history did not retrieve it for 40 years. The mechanism was structural. The outcome was the same. What came next for the men inside the wire was not the end of their war, only the end of the part that the textbooks would eventually agree to remember. What the Feldpost finally said, and the decades it took to hear it, in the basement of the Museum for Communication on Leipziger Straße in Berlin, somewhere between 1.3 and 3 million Feldpost letters from German soldiers of the Second World War sit in acid-free boxes, and each one has a return address, a date, and a handwriting that is no longer in dispute. The collection grew through donations across the post-war decades. Widows died and their children sent the letters in. Sons emptied the attics of mothers who had outlived their husbands by half a century. Grandchildren found the bundles tied with string in farmhouse drawers across Bavaria, Württemberg, Saxony, and the Rhineland, and gave them to the archive rather than throw them away. The Deutsches Tagebucharchiv at Emmendingen, founded in 1998 in the Black Forest village from which it takes its name, holds tens of thousands more. Diaries, letter collections, family papers donated by Germans who lived through the regime and the war and the long silence that followed. The catalogue of the West here in those letters is granular beyond what any post-war memoir could reproduce. The Feldpost number 28,344 of the 352nd Infantry Division. The Feldpost number 25,686 of the 716th. The Feldpost number 31,075 of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Each number routes to a unit. Each unit routes to a sector. Each sector routes to a date. The letters in the boxes, sorted by Feldpost number, reconstruct the operational map of the German army in the West week by week from the point of view of the men inside it. The institutional retrieval of this archive came slowly. The Militärgeschichtliches Forschungsamt, the West German Army's Military History Research Office, was founded at Freiburg in 1957. Its mission in the early decades was the operational history of the Wehrmacht, written by former Wehrmacht officers who had survived the war. The 10-volume series Das Deutsche Reich und der Zweite Weltkrieg, published from 1979 to 2008, transformed the field. It was archival, documented, and willing to follow the record where it led. Its volumes on the Eastern Front and on the regime's crimes inside the occupied Soviet Union forced the institutional acknowledgement that the clean Wehrmacht framing of the 1950s could not survive the documents. The MGFA, restructured in 2013 as the Zentrum für Militärgeschichte und Sozialwissenschaften der Bundeswehr, ZMSBW, remains the central institutional voice of professional German military history. Its library catalogue, open to any reader, lists more than 350,000 volumes. The reckoning forced into public view came in 1995. The Hamburg Institute for Social Research opened the exhibition known as the Wehrmachtsausstellung, Crimes of the Wehrmacht, in March of that year, curated by the historian Hannes Heer with colleagues including Klaus Naumann. The exhibition travelled to 33 German and Austrian cities through 1999. It drew protests of a kind not seen in post-war Germany since the broadcast of the American miniseries Holocaust in 1979. It also drew critique from professional historians on points of factual detail, which led to its revision and reopening in 2001 under tighter documentary standards. The revised exhibition closed in 2004. What it had done could not be undone. The Clean Wehrmacht thesis, already eroding in specialist scholarship for 2 decades, could no longer be defended in serious public conversation. The cumulative attendance of the original and revised exhibitions exceeded 1.2 million visitors. The institutional silence of 50 years had been broken in a public square, in front of cameras, in cities the men of the West here had once been recruited from. The historian Wolfram Wetter, in his 2002 study Die Wehrmacht, Feindbilder, Vernichtungskrieg, Legenden, published in English in 2006 as the Wehrmacht, History, Myth, Reality, synthesized the post-war scholarly reckoning into a single volume. Peter Lieb's archival reconstruction of the West here followed in 2007. The granular operational history of the army in the West was no longer a specialist secret. It was in print, peer-reviewed and citable. And then, in the early 2000s, came the archive nobody had known still existed. Between 1942 and 1945, the British Military Intelligence Service had operated a discreet interrogation facility at Trent Park, a country house in North London, where captured senior German officers, generals, colonels, U-boat commanders, were held in conditions of relative comfort. The rooms were bugged. The conversations were transcribed. The transcripts ran to approximately 50,000 pages. After the war, the files were classified and held at the British Archives at Kew under the WO 208 series. They were released in stages between the late 1990s and the early 2000s. The German historian Sönke Neitzel discovered them in 2001. With the social psychologist Harald Welzer, he produced in 2011 the volume Soldaten, Protokolle vom Kämpfen, Töten und Sterben, published in English as Soldaten, on fighting, killing and dying. The book reconstructed from the German prisoners' own unguarded conversations recorded without their knowledge the mental world of the Wehrmacht in its own voice. The granularity of the source is without parallel. The conversations covered tactics, comrades, women, food, music, and the casual narration of acts the men assumed would never reach a courtroom or a historian's desk. What the Trent Park transcripts and the Feldpost archive together established is no longer in serious historiographic dispute. The Western Front Lanzer of 1944 was exhausted, undernourished, often a non-German conscript, frequently a veteran of the Eastern Front, sometimes a committed Nazi, more often not, loyal to his immediate comrades, contemptuous of the regime in his private letters, obedient in his actions, complicit in the apparatus he served, and aware, by the spring of 1944, that the war could not be won. The portrait is documented, the portrait is checkable, the portrait is in the catalogue. The legal reckoning had run on a parallel track. The Ulm Einsatzkommando trial of 1958, conducted in the West German court system rather than under Allied jurisdiction, broke the post-war assumption that the worst regime actions had been confined to the SS leadership. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965, conducted by the state prosecutor Fritz Bauer, brought the camp staff before German judges and German juries. The trials forced the German public, through the press, through the witness testimony, through the documents entered into evidence, to confront a record that the political conveniences of the 1950s had preferred to leave compressed. The journalist Bernd Naumann's daily reporting from the Frankfurt courtroom, collected and published in 1965, remains one of the documentary monuments of the German reckoning. In the same decades, the German oral history projects began their work. The Zeitzeugen, witnesses of the time, were recorded in their final years across the 1990s and 2000s by university programs, regional archives, and state broadcasters. The Bundesarchiv collection at Koblenz holds thousands of hours of recorded testimony. The Württemberg State Archive at Stuttgart holds dozens of recorded Westheer veterans from the towns and villages of the southwestern land, men in their 80s and 90s speaking to historians and to their own grandchildren about what they had carried in silence for half a century. The recordings are time-stamped, indexed, and cross-referenced to the Feldpost holdings. Many of the men named in the Feldpost letters can be heard in old age, describing the same days from memory. Here is the part the cinematic and popular memory of the Western Front has not yet caught up to. The Westheer's granular history is not contested by serious historians. The named units, the named men, the named letters, the named POW transcripts, the named operational orders, the named war diaries, the named medical reports, the named ration tables, the named survivor testimonies, the named historians and the years their books appeared. All of it is published. All of it is peer-reviewed. All of it is digitized or in the process of digitization. All of it is accessible to any reader with a library card and the willingness to sit down with it. The modern schoolchild in Stuttgart in 2024 can read the actual June 1944 Feldpost letter of a 32-year-old Obergefreiter from her own town in his own handwriting, in a way her grandmother could not have in 1960. The record was always there. What had been missing was the willingness, institutional, political, generational, to read what it actually said. The proof already exists inside the archive. The gap is not evidentiary, it is delivery. The record was always there. What had been missing was the willingness, institutional, political, generational, to read what it actually said. The letter is dated June 2nd, 1944. It is addressed to a young woman in a village outside Heilbronn in Württemberg. The Obergefreiter who wrote it had been at WN 62 for 11 weeks. He was 32 years old. He had served on the Eastern Front through the winter of 1941 to 1942 and the summer of 1943. He weighed 61 kilograms when his unit was issued its last weighing on May 28, 1944, 11 kilograms below the Army standard for his height. He wrote in pencil because the ink in his fountain pen had frozen during the previous winter on the Eastern Front, and the nib was no longer reliable. He told her in a sentence the post-war historians would not read until decades later that he did not believe the wall he had been ordered to defend would hold. He posted the letter on June 4, 1944. He was alive when it left the field post. He was no longer alive when the reply she wrote on June 10th arrived at his Feldpost number. She received the official notification 3 weeks later. She did not remarry. She lived for 47 years after his death in the same village and donated the letter, with the others he had sent, to the Museum for Communication through her son in 1996. An archivist catalogued it in 2008. 4 names, 1 letter. The propaganda poster was a lie. The cartoon was a lie. The man in the bunker was 32 years old, 11 kilograms underweight, and he wrote his name at the bottom of a piece of paper that is still in the catalogue. The archive remembers him. The history industry took 40 years to learn how to read what it remembered. This content is for educational and historical reflection purposes only. For academic citation, please consult the primary archival sources referenced.